Chapter 22, The Revolution in Energy and Industry. And in this chapter, we'll be looking at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and how the invention of Richard Arkwright of a spinning machine led to a revolution in textiles and then other industries, and then how that began to spread throughout continental Europe and how it affected the relationship between factory owners and factory workers. The Industrial Revolution in Britain. And of course, this began in the 18th century, so we're looking at 1700s. There began to be industrial changes between 1780 and 1850, and this grew out of a long process of development. It wasn't really anything that happened overnight. The expanding Atlantic economy served mercantilist Britain really well because it provided them with a growing market for British manufactured goods. And so English farmers were continually changing their methods of farming, increasing their productivity, which meant bountiful crops, which in turn led to lower food prices because the more you have of something, the less you charge for it, or the less rare it is. So for those farmers who were producing all these new crops, they didn't have to spend almost everything they owned to buy bread. And so that meant that an English family could spend more on manufactured goods. And so that is in turn what fueled this British Industrial Revolution. And so members of an average British family began to redirect their labor away from unpaid work for household consumption toward work for wages that they could spend on goods. And so you see a lot of people leaving the agricultural industry to go work at a job where they will be paid, and not paid in food for their family, but paid in actual wages. So there was actually a canal building boom as well during this time that greatly enhanced the movement of the critical raw materials needed to fuel this revolution. And these raw materials were coal and iron. So they literally fueled the machines that made this revolution possible. So Britain's host of assets, like people leaving the farm, having iron and coal deposits, having new capital, helped give rise to its industrial leadership. And this also included an effective central bank and well-developed credit markets. And so the monarchy of England and the aristocratic oligarchy provided a stable and predictable government that allowed the domestic economy to operate with very few controls, which encouraged personal initiative or personal hard work, technical change, and a free market. And you've heard the term free market economy. In a true free market economy, there are no government controls. The one in Britain at the time, there were some government controls, but by and large, they let competition regulate the market. So Britain's rural wage earners, and these numbers actually increase with the second round of land enclosures. But these wage earners were relatively mobile, and along with the cottage workers, they formed a potential industrial labor force for capitalist entrepreneurs. And all of these factors combined initiated the Industrial Revolution, and this term was first coined by contemporaries in the 1830s. So the great economic and political revolutions that really shaped the modern world occurred almost simultaneously, but they began in different countries. So the first, factories. Under the pressure of growing demand, the putting out system's limitations began to outweigh its advantages, probably for the first time since its inception, especially in the British textile industry after around 1760. And there was a constant shortage of thread in the textile industry, and so this focused attention on ways of improving spinning. And so James Hargreaves We're going to have a lot of names that I have to fit in here on my phone, so we'll see how that works. That's a G. James Hargreaves invented this simple hand-powered cotton spinning jenny around 1765, and it was almost invented around the same time that Richard Arkwright developed another kind of spinning machine called the water frame, and I'll put his name here as well. Both important textile inventors. So James Hargreaves and Richard Arkwright. Again, Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, and Richard Arkwright developed the water frame. And so by 1790, these new machines were producing about 10 times as much cotton yarn as had been made in 1770. And the capacity of Arkwright's water frame for several hundred spindles meant that much more power, water power, was needed. And this required large specialized mills that would employ about 1,000 people from the very beginning. And so if you were to compare in your mind for a second what the putting out system looked like in the cottage industry with these giant 1,000 worker factories. On top of that, Samuel Crompton invented another technique for spinning cotton that required more power than any human arm could supply. And so eventually all cotton spinning was gradually concentrated in the factories. It was a task too difficult for one person. And so cotton goods became cheaper, and they were increasingly bought and treasured by members of all classes. And so the wages of weavers rose markedly, and large number of agricultural laborers became hand-loom weavers because they could not only earn wages, but earn decent wages. And so in 1785, Edmund Cartwright, and I'll put his name up here. Sorry for the writing. I know it's terrible. It's a C-A-R-T-W-R-I-G-H-T. So Edmund Cartwright invented a power loom that began to fill factories after 1800. And because adults were reluctant to work in the poor conditions of the early cotton factories, owners turned to children, not only children, but orphans or foundlings who were in the care of local parishes. And so these children were apprenticed to work as early as 5 or 6 years old, and boys and girls were forced by law to labor for their quote-unquote masters for as many as 14 years. And of course, they were working appalling hours, as many as 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, children 5 and 6 years old. And this was for little or no pay, but under brutal discipline. And so these orphans were exploited on an unprecedented scale. And this eventually reinforced more humanitarian attitudes toward children, resulting in laws that would protect young children in the workplace. The problem of energy. So in the medieval period, people began to develop water mills to grind their grain and windmills to pump water and to drain swamps. More efficient use of water and wind in the 16th and 17th centuries allowed human beings to accomplish a lot more than they previously had. And for the most part, agricultural societies continued to rely heavily on wood for energy. And of course, human beings and animals performed most of the work, so that no matter how hard people worked, they really couldn't produce very much. And this was one of the major problems of the agricultural system. The shortage of energy had become really severe in Britain by the 18th century, with wood, which was just a basic raw material, which also served as the primary heating source for most homes and industry, was in ever shorter supply. And so the iron industry's appetite for wood was enormous. And by 1740, the British iron industry was stagnating because of the shortage of wood. And so ultimately, this would lead people to look for another source of energy. The steam engine breakthrough. So Britain looked toward its abundant and widely scattered coal reserves as an alternative to its vanishing wood. And coal was so cheap, it was almost free, and there was an abundance of it. And so mines were dug deeper and deeper, and mechanical pumps, which were usually powered by animals walking in circles at the surface, had to be installed to pump out the water so that they could get to the coal. And to overcome the expense of this method, Thomas Savery and Thomas Newcomen in 1705 invented the first primitive steam engines. And in 1763, James Watt was actually called on to repair a Newcomen engine, which was being used in a physics course at Glasgow University. And after several observations, Watt added a separate condenser to the Newcomen engine that greatly increased the efficiency of the steam engine. And so he patented his invention in 1775. And 6 years later, he formed a partnership with a guy named Matthew Boulton, who was a wealthy English industrialist with plenty of capital and excellent sales skills. And so by the late 1780s, they had made the steam engine a practical and a commercial success in Britain. Steam engines were incredibly useful. They were used to drain mines, increase coal production. It replaced water power in the spinning mills, flour mills, and flint mills. And steam-driven bellows radically transformed the iron industry. And so the production of iron increased from 17,000 tons in 1740 to 3 million tons in 1844. And so once scarce and expensive, iron became the cheap and indispensable building block of the economy because of the steam engine. The coming of the railroads. Even though more and more roads were being built by the second half of the 18th century, overland freight shipment was still very expensive and really limited. And in the 1820s, these English engineers had created steam cars that were capable of carrying passengers. And it carried about 14 people, but it only went 10 miles an hour. On top of that, the noisy, heavy steam automobiles damaged themselves and the roads with their vibrations. And so a rail capable of supporting a heavy locomotive was developed in 1816. And then George Stephenson built the first effective locomotive in 1825. And so in 1830, Stephenson's locomotive called the Rocket sped down the track of the just newly completed Liverpool and Manchester Railway at a whopping 16 miles per hour. And so with the financial and technical success of the Liverpool-Manchester line, many private companies were quickly organizing to build more and more rail lines. And so the railroad dramatically reduced the cost and the uncertainty of shipping freight over land, which made markets larger and even nationwide. And in all countries, the construction of the railroads created a strong demand for unskilled labor and contributed to the growth of the class of urban workers. And so the railroad changed the outlook and the values of the entire society as it revealed the power and increased the speed of this new railway age. So massive new train stations became like the cathedrals of the industrial age, and leading railway engineers built these tunnels that would pierce through mountains and bridges that would span valleys, and these became public idols. So industry and population. In 1851, London hosted an industrial fair called the Great Exhibition in the newly built Crystal Palace, which was an architectural masterpiece that actually helped to draw millions of visitors. And in 1860, Britain, which was considered, quote, the workshop of the world, they produced a truly remarkable 20% of the entire world's output of industrial goods. And if you're looking back to 1750, just 110 years before, they had only produced about 2% of the world's total. And so Britain became known as the workshop of the world because they were producing 20% of the world's industrial goods. Although the gross national product, or the GNP of Britain, rose about fourfold at constant prices between 1780 and 1851, the population grew from about 9 million to 21 million during the same period, consuming much of the increase in total production. A contemporary observer of this phenomenon, Thomas Malthus, argued that the population would always tend to grow faster than the food supply. And in his essay on the principle of population, he concluded that the prudential restraint was the only hope of warding off such positive checks on population growth as war, famine, and disease. So he believed that population would grow and grow and grow, and the food supply would not grow with it. And he believed that in order for people to not starve to death, there had to be wars and famines and diseases to kill off some of these people. Leading English economist David Ricardo, I'll put his name up here as well, developed the iron law of wages. And the iron law of wages stated that the pressure of population growth would always cause wages to sink to subsistence level, meaning wages would just be high enough to keep workers from starving. And so Malthus and Ricardo set this really negative tone, and economics would soon be dubbed the dismal science. But thankfully, Malthus and Ricardo were proved wrong in the long run. And tomorrow we'll pick up with industrialization in continental Europe.